In the summer of 1973, in a quiet working-class neighborhood in Ohio, a newly married young woman vanished without a trace. Police searched everywhere. They found nothing, no evidence, no leads, no body. The case went cold within weeks and stayed cold for an entire generation. Hope had died completely, buried under 3 decades of silence. And then, one ordinary night, a single discovery on the internet tore that silence wide open. What her younger brother found on an early social media site exposed a secret that no one in their family was prepared for. This is the story of Clara Miller, known for the briefest and most dangerous chapter of her life as Clara Evans. To understand how Clara disappeared, you have to understand the world she disappeared into. It was 1973. No cell phones, no tracking apps, no cameras on every corner. If you wanted to vanish back then, you could, and if someone wanted to make you vanish, it was terrifyingly easy. Clara was 22. Long dark hair, a warm smile, the kind of gentle presence that made an entire town feel like it knew her personally. She worked at the local diner, pouring coffee for factory workers, listening to their stories like they mattered. Because to her, they did. She was fiercely devoted to her family, especially her younger brother Thomas, 15 years old at the time. Their father had died a few years earlier, and their mother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. So Clara raised Thomas in every way that counted. She checked his homework, she cooked his dinners. She stood between him and the rougher kids in the neighborhood. Thomas looked up to her more than anyone else on earth. She was his rock, and Clara had promised him no matter what happened in her life, she would always look out for him. At least, that's what Thomas believed. Then, Richard Evans came to town. Richard was 26. Sharp-dressed, easy smile, a muscle car he kept spotless. He carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that made people look twice. He started showing up at the diner, sitting at Clara's counter, ordering black coffee. Talking, he was smooth. Polite, he tipped well. Before long, Richard and Clara were dating, and on the surface, it looked like a fairy tale. Gifts, dinners in the city, promises of a life far away from the struggle she'd grown up in. Clara was swept off her feet, and who could blame her? She'd spent her whole life taking care of everyone else. Now, finally, someone was promising to take care of her. But Thomas didn't trust him. Not for a second. He couldn't have told you why exactly Richard was polite to their mother. Richard smiled easily. But Thomas noticed the small things, the way Richard interrupted Clara mid-sentence, the way his jaw tightened when she spent too long talking to old friends, the flicker of something cold behind his eyes whenever someone disagreed with him. It didn't add up. It just didn't. One evening, while Clara got ready for a date, Thomas stood in her doorway and told her, flat out, that he didn't trust Richard, that he didn't think she really knew this man. Clara just laughed softly and patted his cheek. "He loves me, Tommy," she said. "He's going to take care of us. You don't have to worry anymore." Everything moved fast after that. Too fast. After only 4 months, Richard proposed. Clara said yes. They married in a small church that June Clara in a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, radiant, nervous, hopeful. Thomas stood in the pews and felt something heavy settle in his chest. He watched Richard slide the ring onto her finger and thought, for reasons he couldn't explain, that it looked less like a wedding and more like a trap closing. At the reception, he saw it. Clara dancing with her new husband, her eyes darting around the room. At one point, Richard grabbed her arm, not violently, but firm. Too firm. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear. Her smile disappeared. She stared at the floor. That was the last time Thomas saw his sister look like herself. Right after the wedding, Richard announced a new job in Arizona. They were leaving immediately. Clara had never lived outside their small Ohio town. She didn't want to leave her mother. She didn't want to leave Thomas. But Richard insisted it was a fresh start. A week later, the car was packed. Clara hugged her mother on the porch, both of them crying. Then she turned to Thomas and held him for a long time. "I'll call you every Sunday, Tommy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Every single Sunday, I promise. I'll always be your big sister." Thomas watched Richard's hand settle on the small of her back, guiding her into the passenger seat. The engine started. The car pulled away and disappeared around the corner. The house felt hollow after that. For the first month, Clara kept her promise. Every Sunday at 6 o'clock sharp, the yellow rotary phone in the kitchen would ring, and Thomas would race to answer it. She told him about Arizona, the heat, the strange cactus plants, the impossibly blue sky. But her voice sounded distant, hollow, like she was reading from a script. When he asked if she was happy, she always said yes a little too quickly. When he asked to speak to Richard, there was always an excuse. Out at the store, fixing the car. By August, the calls got shorter. Clara sounded tired. Sometimes Thomas could hear Richard's voice in the background, sharp and clipped, and Clara would hang up fast. Something was wrong. Really wrong. Then came the first Sunday of September 1973. 6 o'clock passed. 6:30. 7. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the silent phone. His mother tried to comfort him. Maybe Clara was just busy, but Thomas knew his sister. She never broke a promise to him. Never. At 11:45 that night, deep in the silence of the house, the phone finally rang. It was so loud it made him jump. He grabbed it in the dark. Tommy. It was Clara. Barely a whisper. Crying real, terrified crying. "Clara, what's wrong? Where are you? Listen to me," she sobbed. "You have to promise me you'll take care of Mom. Promise me." "Clara, stop it. You're scaring me. Let me talk to Richard." "No." Her voice cracked with panic. Don't mention him. Tommy, I'm leaving. I'm coming home. I can't stay here. He's not who we thought he was." Then a crash. Loud, like a door kicked off its hinges. A scream. Short, sharp, pure terror. Then the line went dead. "Clara." Thomas screamed into the receiver. Nothing, just the flat, endless drone of the dial tone. He dropped the phone and ran to wake his mother. They called the operator, trying to trace the call, but in 1973, tracing a disconnected long-distance call was next to impossible for ordinary people. They called the Ohio police, who told them to contact Arizona. For 2 agonizing days, they waited, calling the Arizona precinct over and over. Finally, a detective called back. His voice was calm. Too calm for the nightmare Thomas was living. He said officers had visited the house. Richard was there. Cooperative, according to Richard, he and Clara had a terrible argument Sunday night. She'd packed a suitcase, taken the cash in the house, and walked out. He claimed he watched her get into a dark sedan waiting down the street. He said she'd met someone else. "That's a lie," Thomas screamed into the phone. She was crying. She said she was coming home. He did something to her. The detective sighed the sigh of a tired man with no patience left. "Son, we searched the house. No signs of a struggle. Her clothes are gone, her toothbrush is gone. She's an adult. If she wants to leave her husband and start over, that's not a crime. Because there was no blood, no weapon, no crime scene. The police classified Clara as a voluntary runaway. A report was filed. No active search followed. Richard left Arizona a week later. He never called Clara's mother. He simply vanished, leaving Thomas and his mother shattered in Ohio. For weeks, Thomas sat by the front window, waiting for a taxi, a bus, anything, waiting for Clara to walk up the driveway with her suitcase. Autumn turned to winter. She never came. For 31 years, Thomas lived with the echo of his sister's scream. He grew up, got married, had children, watched his mother pass away, her heart broken, never knowing what happened to her daughter. The police closed the file. The world forgot about Clara Evans. Thomas never did. He spent decades combing libraries, phone books, writing letters to precincts in other states, searching for Richard for anything. He found nothing. It was as if both of them had been erased from existence. Then, in 2004, everything changed. The internet was starting to connect people in ways no one had imagined: message boards, early social networks, digital photo albums slowly mapping the world. One night, sitting at his bulky desktop computer, Thomas typed names into a newly launched social site, something he did almost every night now. Part of a quiet, desperate routine. He wasn't looking for Clara anymore. He'd accepted, long ago, that she was dead. He was looking for Richard. He wanted to look the man in the eye and finally get the truth. Then he clicked into a stranger's public photo album from a small, isolated town in Oregon, and his blood went cold. There, in the background of a photo taken at a crowded county fair, was a woman. Early 50s. Graying hair, a faded denim jacket, slightly out of focus, just a face in the crowd. But Thomas knew that face. The shape of her jaw, the tilt of her smile. It was Clara. She was alive. But if she was alive, why had she let her family believe she was dead for 31 years? And who was the man standing right behind her in the photo? Thomas leaned in until his nose nearly touched the screen. His hands shook. He clicked to zoom, and the image broke into blur, but it didn't matter. He knew those eyes. He knew the exact slope of her shoulders. For 31 years he'd imagined her in a shallow grave somewhere in the desert. He'd mourned her, watched his mother cry herself to sleep night after night until her heart finally gave out. And now she was staring back at him from a photo uploaded 3 weeks ago. Sarah. He called, his voice cracking. Sarah. Come here now. His wife rushed in, saw his face, and thought he was having a heart attack. Then she looked at the screen. That's Clara, Thomas whispered. Sarah had never met her, but she'd lived with the ghost of her for their entire marriage. She leaned closer. The bone structure, the mouth, the deep-set eyes, an older, tired version of the smiling 22-year-old in the wedding photos. Tom. Sarah breathed. Are you sure? It's been so long people can look alike. It's her. Thomas pointed to a faint mark near the woman's collarbone. She has a birthmark right there. Small, crescent-shaped. Sarah looked closer. He was right. Then Thomas noticed a man standing directly behind her. Tall, flannel shirt. A dark hunting cap pulled low. His hand rested heavily on her shoulder, not affectionate. Something else. Something that looked less like an embrace and more like a warning. Not Richard. This man was bigger, broader, someone else entirely. Thomas found the web address. The photo belonged to a small community message board for a town called Pine Valley, tucked deep in the forests of Oregon. Album title, Pine Valley Autumn Harvest Festival, 2004. Uploaded by a user named Dave Ford. Thomas messaged him, immediately kept it simple. Said he was looking for a long-lost relative. Asked about the woman in photo 17. Then came the waiting. The worst days of his life. He couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. Called out of work. Just sat there, refreshing his inbox every 5 minutes, staring at the face of the sister he'd thought was dead. Relief mixed with something darker: anger. If Clara was alive, why hadn't she called? She knew their mother had been sick. She knew Thomas had never stopped searching. She'd promised to always look out for him. How could she abandon them for 31 years? Finally, Thursday morning, Dave replied. Short message. Sorry, didn't know her. Just took crowd shots for the community site. Over 1,000 people there that day, no names collected. Good luck. A dead end, but also a confirmation. She'd been in Pine Valley, Oregon, at least 3 weeks ago. Thomas printed the photo, stuffed it into a manila envelope with Clara's old missing person file, and drove straight to the police station. Detective Harris, young, exhausted, Patient listened to the whole story. Looked at the 1973 wedding photo. Looked at the grainy printout. "Mr. Miller," he said gently, "I understand how much you want this to be her, but this is a blurry photo from the internet. It could be anyone." "Look at the birthmark," Thomas insisted. "Look at her face. She's alive. You have to call out there. Do a wellness check." "Even if it is her," Harris said, "she left as an adult. The case was closed as a voluntary runaway. Starting a new life isn't a crime. Her husband attacked her. I heard her scream on the phone. Someone took her. You have to check." Harris studied him for a long moment, saw the desperation, and finally agreed to call Pine Valley Sheriff's Department. 2 days later, the answer came back. Nothing. No Clara Evans. No Clara Miller. DMV, property records, voter rolls checked across the entire state. Nobody in Pine Valley recognized the photo. Whoever the woman was, she wasn't living under Clara's name. For a week, Thomas fell into a fog of grief. It felt like losing her all over again. But he wasn't 15 anymore. He was a grown man, and he was obsessed. If the police wouldn't help, he'd do it himself. He realized searching for her real name was pointless if she was hiding. She'd have changed it. He needed her face. Local records, school directories, church bulletins, real estate listings, anything a small town might have scanned online. Weeks passed. Then, on a rainy Tuesday night, he found it, an online archive of the Pine Valley Gazette, recently digitized back to the late 90s. An October 1998 issue. Page 4. A small photo in the corner. Local resident Mary Ann Cutler wins annual baking competition. A woman stood beside a table of pies, holding a blue ribbon, smiling for the camera. It was Clara. No doubt at all. The smile, the eyes, the birthmark, clearly visible above her collar. Mary Ann Cutler, Thomas whispered. A new name. He'd found her. He could call the police right now with a real name and force them to act. But as he read further, his victory turned to ice. Mary Ann moved to Pine Valley in 1974, searching for a quiet life after a terrible tragedy, the sole survivor of a house fire in Ohio that claimed the lives of her mother and younger brother. The words blurred. A house fire. Her mother and brother, dead. Why would Clara invent a story like that? She hadn't just hidden from them, she'd killed them off in her own mind. Erased them. And if she wasn't hiding from Richard, what or who was she really hiding from? Then, he saw it. In the shadows behind her in the photo, the same tall man in the heavy coat and hunting cap, watching the camera. This time the image was clear enough, and Thomas recognized him. It wasn't Richard. It was a man Thomas hadn't seen since the summer of 1973, a man deeply connected to the police department back home. His name was Arthur Vance. Back in '73, Arthur Vance had been a rookie cop, 24 years old, patrolling their neighborhood, waving to kids on the street, eating lunch at the diner where Clara worked, always in her section, always talking a little too long. He was the officer who'd responded the night of Clara's final call. He'd sat at their kitchen table with a notepad, calming their hysterical mother with a smooth, practiced voice. "It's a jurisdictional issue, ma'am. She's out in Arizona now. Runaways usually come back once they cool off. You just have to be patient." He'd been the middleman for the entire investigation, the one who relayed Richard's story, the one who eventually let the case go cold. And now, 31 years later, Arthur Vance was living in an isolated Oregon logging town with Thomas's dead sister. None of it made sense. If Vance had taken Clara, why was she smiling at a baking contest 25 years later? Why the story about the fire? What about Richard? What about the scream Thomas had heard down the phone line? He printed the article, added it to the envelope, and drove to the county library's microfilm archive. 3 hours of scrolling old newspapers, eyes burning, before he found a brief item in the police blotter, March 1974. Officer Arthur Vance resigning from the force to pursue private security work out of state. March 1974. 6 months after Clara disappeared, he kept searching backward into the summer of '73 for any record of Richard Evans. Marriage announcements, property records, arrest logs. Nothing. It was as if Richard hadn't existed before he walked into that diner. That night, Thomas paid for access to an early online public records database. He typed in Richard Evans, using the birth year Clara had once mentioned. The page loaded slowly. One match. A death certificate index. Richard Evans. Born 1947, Pennsylvania, died 1968 drunk driving accident. 5 years before Clara ever met him. Thomas stared at the screen until it blurred. The man who married his sister, the man who supposedly drove her to Arizona, had been using a dead man's identity. The fake husband. The delayed police response. The move across the country. The scream on the phone. It wasn't a disappearance. It was a magic trick. And Arthur Vance had built it. Sarah begged him to call the FBI instead of flying out himself. Thomas wouldn't hear it. The police didn't listen in 1973, he said, throwing clothes into a suitcase, and they aren't listening now. I've lived with this hole in my chest for 31 years. I watched my mother die screaming Clara's name. I'm going to look my sister in the eye and ask her why. The next morning, he was on a flight to Portland. He rented a car and drove 3 hours into the Cascade Mountains, the city giving way to towering pines, creeping fog, and steep isolated roads. Logging country. The kind of place built for disappearing. A rusted sign. Welcome to Pine Valley. Population 1,200. At the hardware store, Thomas asked casually about an old family friend, Mary Ann Cutler. The clerk lit up instantly sweetest lady in town, best cherry pie you'll ever taste, and gave directions up a mountain road, past the old mill, to the only cabin at the end. Thomas followed the dirt path 2 miles up a densely wooded hill, the trees so thick they blocked out the midday light. Then the woods broke open, revealing a 2-story log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. Isolated, if you screamed up here, no one would ever hear. He hid his car behind the tree line and waited. Hours passed. Evening fell. Then a pickup truck rumbled up the road and parked outside the cabin. A man stepped out, heavy boots, flannel jacket, worn cap. Arthur Vance. He walked to the passenger door and helped a woman out. Thomas pressed his hand to the cold glass, tears blurring his vision. It was Clara moving, breathing, 31 years older, 50 yards away. But what he saw next shattered everything he thought he knew. Vance didn't grab her. He carried groceries. Clara laughed at something he said, reached up, brushed dirt off his shoulder. He kissed her cheek. They walked inside, arm in arm. She wasn't a hostage. She was his wife. As she looked genuinely, completely happy. If she was happy, the kidnapping, the scream, the plea for help, had it all been a performance? Has she tortured her 15-year-old brother just to cover her tracks? A cold rage burned through him. But Thomas was smart enough to know he needed proof before he confronted anyone. 2 hours later, the truck left again, Vance and Clara, headlights cutting through the drizzle, gone toward town. The cabin was empty. This was his chance. Thomas broke a small pane of glass on the back door, reached through, and let himself in. Inside, a cozy, spotless kitchen. Copper pots, a bowl of apples, slippers by the door, the smell of cinnamon and firewood, the home of a happy, ordinary couple. It made him sick. He searched a desk in the living room, tax returns, utility bills, all under the names Arthur and Mary Ann Cutler. Nothing about Ohio, nothing about 1973. Upstairs, a neatly made bed, closets full of ordinary clothes. Nothing under the bed. Then in the hallway, he noticed a long runner rug slightly raised near the wall. He pulled it back. A wooden trapdoor, sealed with a heavy steel padlock. He found a meat cleaver in the kitchen, wedged it into the lock, and broke it open. Cold, damp air rushed up from below. Mildew, dust, old motor oil. He climbed down into a large cellar dug into the mountainside, stretching the length of the cabin. Old furniture under sheets, stacked firewood, and in the far corner something huge, covered by a heavy gray tarp. He pulled it back. Cherry red metal, a chrome bumper, Richard's car. The exact muscle car he'd driven Clara away in, 31 years ago. Why was it buried in a locked cellar beneath Arthur and Clara's house? He moved the light to the windshield, a spider-webbed bullet hole, directly in front of the driver's seat. He opened the door. The leather seat was black, soaked through with decades-old blood, pooled onto the floorboards, staining the steering wheel. Richard hadn't run off. He'd been executed in this seat. Then, from above the front door opening, heavy boots on the floor. They were back. Thomas froze in the darkness, pressed against the cold foundation wall, praying Clara wouldn't notice the broken glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the footsteps stopped. Clack. A shotgun chambering around. Mary Vance's voice, low and tight, right above the trapdoor. Get in the truck. Go to the sheriff's office. Don't look back. Go. Footsteps ran. The front door slammed. An engine roared, tires spinning in the mud. Vance was alone now, and he was hunting. The trapdoor light shifted as Vance descended, flashlight sweeping the cellar. I know you're down there, he called, the same calm, controlled voice from 31 years ago. Walk up slow. Hands empty. If I see a weapon, I drop you where you stand. Thomas didn't move. Didn't breathe. Last warning. Vance came down the stairs. As his light swept toward the corner, Thomas lunged, clicking his own flashlight on straight into Vance's eyes. Vance staggered back, cursing, and fired blind. The blast tore through the cellar, chunks of concrete exploding where Thomas had been crouched a second before. You're dead, Vance growled, chambering another round. You hear me? Then sirens. Faint at first, echoing up the valley, growing louder. Clara had made it. She'd brought the police. Vance froze, cursed, killed his light. Boots pounded up the stairs, the trapdoor slammed shut, something heavy dragged across it. Then the front door, and running feet disappearing into the woods. Thomas was trapped in the dark but alive. Minutes later, deputies pulled him out of the cellar and cuffed him against the wall, certain they'd caught an intruder until Thomas told them who he was, and who Clara really was, and what was buried beneath the floor. A deputy went down and came back pale. Sheriff, there's a car down there. Looks like a 70 model. And there's a lot of blood. They set up a perimeter. Called for backup. Vance was running through the mountains with a head start and a shotgun. Thomas sat handcuffed in the back of a cruiser, rain hammering the roof, when another car pulled up. Clara stepped out, small in her wool coat, trembling. She walked to his window and pressed her hand against the wet glass. For the first time in 31 years, they looked each other in the eye. He mouthed one word. Why? She closed her eyes and wept. Then the radio crackled. Vance was in custody, caught near the old logging road, surrendered without a fight. At the station, Thomas sat across from his sister in a cold interrogation room. You promised, he said, his voice breaking. You stood on that porch in your wedding dress and promised you'd always look out for me. You let Mom die thinking you'd been murdered. Clara sobbed into her hands. I'm sorry, Tommy. I had to protect you. If I'd told the truth, you would have died too. Protect me from what? From a cop who shot your husband? Why are you married to the man who killed him? She looked up, hollowed out by decades of grief. Arthur didn't kill him, Tommy. Her hands shook on the table. Because Arthur wasn't there. She swallowed hard. I did. The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I saw the car, Thomas whispered. The bullet hole. The blood. Someone executed him. I know, Clara said. Because it was me. She told him everything. The moment they crossed the Ohio state line, Richard had stopped pretending. He isolated her in a rented house in the middle of nowhere, took her shoes so she couldn't run, locked the doors from the outside. If she spoke without permission, he hit her. If she cried, he hit her harder. He told her that if she ever tried to leave, he'd drive back to Ohio and burn their mother's house down with Thomas inside it. Every Sunday call, he'd stood behind her with a gun pressed to her ribs, feeding her lines to read. The night of the final call, he'd been drunk, dangerously drunk. He told her he was bored of her, that they were taking a drive into the desert, as she wasn't coming back. While he was in the bathroom, she'd grab the phone in the dark, just to hear her brother's voice one last time. Richard caught her kick the door in. That was the crash Thomas had heard, dragged her out by her hair, threw her in the car. Miles into the desert, pitch black, he reached for the gun in the glove box. He was too drunk to work the latch. Clara got there first. I didn't even think, Tommy, I just pointed it at him and pulled the trigger. Over and over. She'd sat there for hours afterward, in the dark, covered in his blood, 22 years old and utterly alone. She knew what the police would assume. She knew they'd never believe her. So she called the one person who'd ever told her she could trust him, Arthur Vance, back home at the station. He drove 3 days straight to reach her, looked at the car, the stolen money, the fake ID in Richard's wallet, and told her Richard was connected to dangerous people. If the truth came out, they might come for her family. Arthur made his choice that night. He hid the body in the desert. He controlled the fake reports through his badge, closing the case before it started. Then, he drove her out of Arizona for good. They couldn't destroy the car without raising questions, and they couldn't risk leaving it behind either, so they carried it with them, all the way to the most remote place they could find. They dug the cellar first, lowered the car into it, built the cabin on top, a secret buried beneath the floorboards of an ordinary life. New names, a fabricated tragedy, the house fire, so no one would ever ask about the family they'd left behind. We fell in love, Tommy, Clara said. He gave up everything to protect me. He's not a murderer. I am. The sheriff walked in a few minutes later, holding a folder. We ran the fingerprints from the trunk, he said. Took the federal database a few hours, given how old they were. He looked at Clara. The man you knew as Richard Evans was actually named Marcus Vance. No relation to Arthur. He was a fugitive out of Chicago, armed robbery, extortion, and suspected in the disappearances of 2 other young women in the late 60s. Clara went white, hand over her mouth. If you hadn't shot him, Mrs. Cutler, the sheriff said quietly, you'd have been buried in that desert right next to them. He told them Arthur had confessed to everything, the cover-up, the body, the car. But the statute of limitations on tampering with evidence and false reports had expired decades ago. And it was, in his words, incredibly difficult to prosecute someone for protecting a woman from a wanted serial killer using a dead man's name. He saw no reason to keep an old woman and her husband in a cell while the lawyers figured out if there was even a case left to bring. Clara collapsed into Thomas's arms, sobbing with something that finally felt like relief. The next morning, the rain had cleared. Pine Valley sat under bright, crisp sunlight. Arthur walked out of the station, shoulders slumped, exhausted, until he saw Clara waiting by the cruiser. His whole face changed. He crossed the lot and wrapped his arms around her, and they held on like 2 people who'd survived a shipwreck. He turned to Thomas, guilt written into every line of his tired face. I'm sorry. I know I stole her from you. I know what it cost your family. I just couldn't let him destroy her. Thomas looked at this man he'd spent 2 days hating and saw instead the bravest person he'd ever met. He offered his hand. You saved my sister's life, Arthur. You kept her safe when I couldn't. Thank you. Arthur shook it firmly. Something passed between them, an understanding that needed no more words. Thomas stayed 3 more days. He helped them clean out the cabin. The police had already towed the car away, taking Richard's ghost with it for good. The trapdoor stood open now, fresh air finally moving through a space that had held a secret for 30 years. They sat on the back porch drinking coffee, looking out over the mountains. Clara told him about her garden, her baking contests, the quiet life she'd built out of the wreckage of the worst night of her life. Thomas told her about Sarah, about her nieces and nephews, about how their mother had loved her completely, unconditionally, until her very last breath. There were tears, but for the first time in 31 years, they didn't hurt. When it was time to leave, Clara walked him to the car. "I don't have to look over my shoulder anymore," she said, smiling the same warm smile she'd had at 22, pouring coffee behind the diner counter. "I don't have to hide. I'll call you Sunday," Thomas said. Every Sunday, she promised. And this time, he knew it was a promise she could keep. Driving down the mountain, Thomas watched the pines roll past his window and felt something in his chest finally loosen a weight he'd carried since he was 15 years old. For 31 years, he'd chased a ghost. He'd assumed his sister was a victim, taken, silenced, erased. But the truth was something else entirely. Clara hadn't run from her family. She'd run into the dark, alone, to draw the monster away from the people she loved. She'd buried herself alive so the rest of them could keep living in the light. She'd committed a terrible act, and she'd lied for 3 decades, but she'd done it out of a kind of love most people never have to prove. Somewhere over the clouds, flying home, Thomas thought about the red car that had sat hidden beneath those floorboards for 30 years, and the secret it had held. The world is full of cold cases, closed files, questions nobody ever answers. But every once in a while, if you dig deep enough, you don't find a tragedy. You find a miracle.